sticks, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Trey Orndorff, a political scientist at Oklahoma Christian University, and I'm joined by the professor of law at Chase Law School, Ken Katkin. Ken, welcome on our continuing journey through the U.S. Constitution.
Hey, Trey, it's great to be back.
Yeah, I mean, as we talked about on the weekend show, everybody gets to kind of have us for a trifecta of shows. I love it. So this is the second in our three-part, and you know we're going to get through a bunch of the Constitution. And so last week, what we were dealing with was the first portion of Article 3. So we got through Article 3, Sections 1 and 2. And this week, what we're going to get into is the treason section. We're going to be getting into Section 3. We're going to finish that out. And then we'll move over into Article 4. And we'll undoubtedly not get done with Article 4 today, but we'll at least set up and get into Article 4. So, Ken, why don't we start here? I will do what we always do. I'll read our first section. I'm going to be reading Article 3, Section 1 of the U.S. Constitution, which says, treason against the United States shall consist only in levying war against them or in adhering to their enemies, giving them aid and comfort. No person shall be convicted of treason unless on the testimony of witnesses to share the same overt act or on confession in open court. The Congress shall have the power to declare the punishment of treason, but no attainder of treason shall work corruption of blood or forfeiture except during the life of the person attainted. Whew. So, I mean, it's Section 3, we had been talking about this as we were getting ready for the show. It's not a lot. It's not as if there's a ton of cases that deal with this. We don't have lots of issues of treason. It is unique in the sense, though, Ken, that this is the only portion of the Constitution where the crime is expressly defined by the Constitution rather than via statute. And, you know, both of us had talked about, you know, really one of the earliest and probably the most important cases that deal with this portion of the Constitution comes from Ex parte Bowman, where we have the alleged plot by former Vice President Aaron Burr. Now, I mean, again, I don't know how much everybody knows about the history of this, but there's some pretty strong evidence that while Burr was vice president, he was actually out trying to get his cronies to start a revolution against the United States. And part of the reason he's all isolated and upset was, you know, we talked about this in Article 2 was, right, he kind of thought for a minute he was going to get to be president when he was running for president with Thomas Jefferson. And instead, of course, we have the crisis of the election of 1800. But that gets him kind of politically ostracized from the Thomas Jefferson administration. And so he potentially, you know, there's a lot of evidence that he goes out there and starts maybe recruiting troops, procuring maps, drawing up some plans to overthrow the United States. And his two buddies, you might call them, I don't know, that's right, surrogates, you might say, they'll end up coming up on the first charges ever of treason, although it doesn't actually end up to work out. Marshall will end up arguing that just conspiring to commit treason is different from, in his words, you know, the actual assemblage of men for the purposes of executing a treasonable design. So tell us a little bit about that.
About the clause or about the Burr case or
either
both,
one. Either one.
Okay. Yeah. So I think the big concept in the clause is that it doesn't fully define the crime of treason. There actually is a treason statute as well, which is Section 2381 of the Criminal Code, which is Title 18 of the U.S. Code.
And when does, and this is what I'm actually ignorant on, so help me. When does that code portion go into effect? Because there's a long period of time where, you know, it's not part of the code. When does that happen? Do you know that?
Well, I know that this current language comes from 1948. I don't know. I don't know whether there were predecessor statutes that or not. But the constitutional language it puts some limitations on how the crime of treason can be defined. So it sort of says, because as you read, treason against the United States shall consist only in levying war against them, or in adhering to their enemies or giving them aid and comfort. It's saying you can't have treason be something less than that. So, for instance, let's say Congress, wanted to define treason as, let's say something like January 6th. Congress wanted to define treason as using violence to try to overthrow the government. The idea would be, you'd have to have some element of foreign enemies involved in that. So if it was a purely domestic plot, then that wouldn't be treason. So we actually have a different crime for that, which is called sedition, and that's the crime that Stuart Rhodes was recently convicted under.
Now, I'm curious about that too, Ken. I had thought about this, and do you think part of the reason we have that defined in Article 3, Section 3 is because we wanted to give wiggle room to the possibility of overthrow in cases not being viewed as treason, right? Because otherwise what we did was sort of treasonous, right? But the Constitution says, well, that's not really treasonous because there's no foreign element, right? If you're doing it all internally, that's potentially justifiable philosophically.
Yeah, I mean, right. The Constitution itself overthrew the Articles of Confederation. So there's an element of, we had a government. We had the Continental Congress that was created under the Articles of Confederation. Our founding fathers decided to scrap that. From outside, they didn't use the method within the Articles of Confederation to change it.
Which we're going to get to when we get to the end of the Constitution, which is the the secret clause. Well, one of my favorite. Yeah. Anyway, continue.
Right, exactly right. Yeah, because under the Articles of Confederation, amendments required unanimity. They never had a hope of a unanimous vote to amend it, or at least they didn't think they did, and so they just scrapped it.
And that
could be seen. Yeah, that could be So that could be seen as having overthrown the government, or even as treason against the Articles. But Section 3 of Article 3 is saying, well, that can't count as treason because there was no levying of war, there was no giving aid and comfort to a foreign country that's an enemy country. So you need to have those elements involved for something to be treason. So again, it's not saying exactly what is treason, but it's saying if Congress tries to define treason in a way that doesn't involve the levying of war and that doesn't involve giving aid and comfort to foreign enemies, then that's an unconstitutional definition of treason. It also, the second sentence erects some pretty high evidentiary barriers, that there needs to be a lot of evidence to convict somebody of treason, because there has to be testimony of two witnesses to the same overt act, or alternatively, if the defendant confesses in open court. But there can't be, if there's only one witness who testifies to an overt act, that's not going to be enough to convict somebody of treason just as a matter of law, even if the jury would credit the witness's testimony, unless the defendant actually confesses in open court. And even if the defendant confessed somewhere else, and the prosecutors want to say, well, we have evidence that he made a statement. Maybe even, they didn't have TV then, but today we might have TV footage of somebody making a statement. But if they take the fifth when they go into court and they won't repeat that statement, then their own statement can't be a basis for convicting them of treason either. So between the idea that the acts have to be fairly circumscribed acts, they have to involve levying war, and they have to involve giving aid and comfort to foreign enemies, and there has to be two witnesses or a sworn confession in court that the acts actually happened. The big goal there, and it seems to have been completely satisfied over time, is that it's very hard to convict anybody of treason, and very few people ever have been. And I think the point of that really was largely to protect the democracy, that they didn't want the government kind of entrenching itself, and then we always have an opposition party. They didn't want people who were trying to use ordinary electoral processes to overthrow the party in control to be accused of being treasonous.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, there's a court case, Kramer versus the United States in 1945, that kind of lays, I think, agrees with that view, which basically says in this case, look, even if you are doing things that might be in a line with a foreign enemy, that's not treasonous unless there is an intent to betray, and that you have to have some kind of connection, a cohesion with that external actor as well.
Yeah, I mean, the Kramer case, I only learned about it this morning from you, and I actually wasn't familiar with it. But it's a 1945 case involving a German-born American citizen during World War II who was associating with the German submarine saboteurs. And I don't know if our listeners know about the German submarine saboteurs. They produced their own case, Ex parte Quirin, which also went to the Supreme Court. But one thing that Hitler did in 1942 was he recruited in Germany for Germans who had lived significant amounts of time in the United States. And he found 8 of these guys, each of whom had lived a minimum of 17 years in the United States already. And he put them into 2 submarines. One landed near Long Island in New York, and one landed in Florida. And they were sent with a mission to go commit acts of sabotage at American industrial facilities. And in fact, the 2 groups were supposed to rendezvous right here in Cincinnati, where I am. That was their meeting point. But the plot never got anywhere because most of the Germans who came over in the submarines and who were people who'd all lived in the U.S. for at least 17 years, as soon as they got here, they had a variety of individual secret agendas, ranging from just like not doing it and staying here in the United States to actually informing the FBI about it. And 2 of these guys, 2 of the 8, had a very hard time convincing the FBI that they were for real. So, they went to the FBI office in New York. They said, we just got off a submarine from Germany. We've been sent here to commit sabotage. Another submarine landed at Florida. All 8 of us have all these marching orders. We're supposed to meet in Cincinnati. And the New York FBI office literally refused to talk to them and threw them out and thought they were, crazy people. And one of them took a train down to D.C. and actually demanded to see J. Edgar Hoover, and eventually got listened to. So they rounded up all 8 based on that, and so none of these sabotage plans ever happened. The 8 of them were tried in a military tribunal, and the question of whether they could be tried in a military tribunal was decided by the Supreme Court in the Ex parte Quirin case. The Supreme Court sustained it. They said enemy combatants who are engaged in war crimes can be subject to military justice and don't have to have civil trials. But then there's this side case that you drew my attention to, the Kramer case, where Kramer was one of the Americans who was unaware of the Hitler sabotage plot. Was a German American living in America, but he was someone that was known to some of these German submarine saboteurs. And when the German submarine saboteurs landed, they reacquainted themselves with Kramer. He was like their old friend, and they got him to help them with certain things that they needed to carry out the sabotage plot. These were a couple of the handful of saboteurs who were
interested in actually sabotaging.
Right? And so he helped them a little bit, and he was tried for treason. And convicted in the Federal District Court in New York, and his conviction was sustained by the Second Circuit Court of Appeals in New York. But he took his case up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled that there were not actually 2 witnesses who testified to overt acts, and that the meetings that he had were capable of innocent or guilty explanations and couldn't be seen as overt acts. And that there weren't 2 witnesses that could tie him to any overt acts of sabotage. And so that was an example of really what you and I were both talking about, of the court, keeping that bar very high in terms of being able to convict anybody of treason.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, I'm trying to think who would be the last person convicted of treason.
I don't know, because few. Aaron, even Aaron Burr's co-defendants Bowman and Swartout, who you talked about. They were convicted, but the Supreme Court also reversed their convictions.
Yes, so that does not go forward. Yeah.
Yeah. So just like with Kramer, 150 years later, or 140 years later, Bowman and Swartout. So because Burr's plot was pretty amusing too. Like, not only was Burr first seemingly trying to organize a violent overthrow of the U.S. government and to establish himself as a king. But when that failed, largely because one of his associates also ratted him out. So it was just like with the later German submarine saboteur plot. Bormann had a guy named Wilkinson who was involved, and Wilkinson told President Thomas Jefferson all about the plot, and so Burr had to run away and not try to pull it off. And he ran away all the way out to what's now Utah, and was then in Mexico. That was then in Mexico. And he started even out there meeting with agents of the King of Spain about whether they'd be willing to help set him up as a king out there in Utah, which would become a proxy state for Spain, and maybe one day a staging base to stage war against the United States if the United States tried to expand west. And
well, I'm going to pause you right there, though, Ken, because it actually brings us to the end of our ad-supported executive show preview. So if you'd like to hear the rest of the show with myself and with Ken, you're going to need to head to patreon.com/politicsguys and become a supporter of the show. And one of the great things you get is these long kind of takeaways from the news cycle, where this, for what we've been doing now for the year, for Ken and myself at least, has been to go through the U.S. Constitution. And this conversation about Article 3, we're going to finish that up. We're going to be moving on to Article 4. And if you'd like to be a part of that, you can head to patreon.com/politicsguys, where you can become part of that interaction. You'll also get other potential benefits depending on what you decide to listen to. You can also get ad-free versions of the main weekend show. You can get access to us on Discord, where we go into more detail and interact with listener questions on a variety of topics. It's just a wonderful space. I really love that. But again, the most important, if you're listening right now, you might want to know, well, where does this end? Or maybe you'd like to go back and actually listen to all the episodes that we have done, starting with an overview of the Constitution. If you want to do that, you're going to head to patreon.com/politicsguys. You can also support us on Venmo, where we're at Politics Guys, or you can support the show through PayPal. However you like to do that, all of those support links are in the show notes, so just scroll on down, click more, and you're going to see them all right there. Or if you'd like to do it in your web browser, you can go to politicsguys.com/support and unlock the rest of this. And of course, all the previous episodes Ken and I have done, and that Mike and Jay have done, and May and Jay have done. So we'd love for you to be a part of that. Now, if you'd like to get this midweek show, but you're just not in a position to financially support the podcast right now, that is not a problem at all. Please just send an email out to Mike at politicsguys.com, and he's going to get you set up. Now, whether you're a supporter of the show or not, we'd love if you'd subscribe, rate, or push the show out on social media of your choice. That makes everything a lot easier for us. Now, if you've got any kind of questions or gripes, anything you'd like to share with us, you can always email us at mail@politicsguys.com. We're also on Facebook and Twitter. You'll again find all of those links down there in the show notes. But again, to hear the rest of this show, head to patreon.com/politicsguys and at least hit the $5 level of support. The executive producers of the Politics Guys are Bruce Johnson, Wilma Marino, Andra Masker, Daniel Toe, Ryan Beasley, Don Oglesby, and Ivan English. We'll be back with a new show this weekend, and I hope you'll join us.